I want to know one thing. I thought Biden had it in the bag. That's what the polls were saying. They're saying that it looked like a landslide when we looked at the polls. And then it really wasn't. It really wasn't a landslide. So Alicia was wondering why? Why do you think the polls were so wrong? Why were the analysts so wrong?
So I think like one thing we can consider is how wrong they were also in 2016 when the polls projected that Hillary Clinton would win. And yet again, we see the media predicted this shutout for Biden, right? And a lot of that was predicated on the fact that Trump's approval rating is so low. His handling of the COVID-19 crisis has been an absolute disaster. That alone should have been the basis of a Biden victory, right? Or so you would think. As far as why the polls are off, I mean, I am not an expert, but one thing I've been like really surprised by, and this happened in 2016 as well, and this certainly happened in my home state of Pennsylvania, the Republican Party actually registered a lot of new Republican voters, especially in rural areas. So these might be people who aren't ordinarily engaged by the polls. I myself, as someone who's been able to vote for 12 years now, have only been polled exactly once, right? So they're not reaching everybody, and they're relying on this idea that, you know, Biden had it in the bag because he's not Trump. But that's the problem, right? He's not Trump. He's not running for something. He's just running as not the other guy.
The polls showed that it's not going to be even close. And I think so many people thought that was going to be the case. But then we had the situation of waiting days and nights for actual results. And I think that's a really good point, that they haven't been doing well, not in the last 4 years, but also in other countries as well. And maybe it's because the kind of like the way the politics work, the spectrum of politics and why people are going out to vote has changed massively, because I think people are really, exasperated with the situation. People aren't going to go to vote for someone who they don't believe in. And even though, the situation was still a win, it wasn't even close to what the polls predicted. So I think, it is still, with all of that, it's still a historic mobilization to defeat Trump. So what do you think? What do you think about that? Do you think that, like you said a little bit about how, people weren't going to vote for Biden because Biden had this amazing agenda that everyone wanted to vote for. So how do you think the Democrats did it? And do you think they could have done it better?
So I think the Democrats really blew it. They really could have had this in the bag and could have won by those larger margins, right? They also could have put a lot more time, not just over the past few months during this general election, but over the past 2 years, 4 years, actually engaging working class people, especially in these more rural counties. Often a lot of these cities will naturally vote Democrat because of the more like socially liberal policies that the party pays lip service to, at the very least, right? But they haven't actually been engaging those people or like acknowledging the hardships that a lot of those people are going through. So they could have engaged those voters, but they really didn't. They certainly didn't in Pennsylvania. One thing I did note, though, is that Pennsylvania, to your earlier point, the turnout in Pennsylvania was actually much higher this time around. And actually, I think that has to do with the mail-in ballots. So we've seen a lot of attempts by Trump to really suppress the vote, whether that's by cutting the US Postal Service to slow down the mail, which did absolutely have an impact. In fact, I have a friend who did not receive his ballot until the day after the election. So he didn't get to cast his vote. And that was not going to be a vote for Trump. But despite that, and despite the attempts that we see now by Trump to suppress the vote, with all of these lawsuits, the GOP has several lawsuits in my state. There's a lawsuit locally in my city, in Pittsburgh, and it's not just in Pennsylvania, it's in all of these other states where suddenly Trump finds himself trailing because all of these mail-in votes are being counted. We see a larger turnout. And I think that's because, in part, we can only vote on one day out of the month, out of the year, and it's during the window in which most people are working. And that's like if you work a 9-to-5 job and not multiple jobs, right? And one thing that the Bernie Sanders campaign did back in the primaries that always really impressed me is that they had volunteers reaching out to working class people on the midnight shift to engage them in what was going on and what Bernie Sanders was doing, and to get them to caucus and things like that. That's something that the Biden campaign could have tried to do, right? But they ultimately don't care about the working class voter. They care about the vote, but not the person, right? Not what all of us are going through. And I think that's reflected also in their lack of a program.
Yeah, I think the voter suppression stuff that Alicia was just talking about is really crazy and really important. There was a county in Texas where Houston is, which is a big city in Texas, that literally had one ballot drop box for 5 million people. I mean, this is insane. This isn't democracy, you know? But we should also be clear that despite this, and despite how close it was, actually, if you look at the number of people that voted for Biden versus voted for Trump, it really wasn't that close. Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by 4 million votes. That's a huge amount. But because we have the Electoral College, which, let's be honest, is one of the most undemocratic institutions in the US, and probably one of the more undemocratic institutions in terms of world voting systems, it ended up being, this close. And of course, the Democrats didn't help themselves with this at all. But it really was a historic. I think the fact that 4 million vote gap exists shows how historic of mobilization this was against Trump, how much people hate Trump. It's not, I don't think, this crazy enthusiastic endorsement of corporate Joe Biden, but just how much people really hated him.